Shalom, shalom, bruchim habayim. Welcome to Beit Shira congregation. My name is Rabbi Jesse Mordechai Chair, and this is amazing. It is, we're in the month of Elul, and to see this crowd this evening, I almost want to start off by, Bahu rachum yechaper avon v'lo yashchid. I want to daven Mariv with this incredible crowd. This is amazing. We are here this evening. Again, we are blessed and honored. We have an incredible guest here, Yoram Ettinger. So, let's, nu kapayim, let's put our hands together. So Yoram is going to speak. I just want to share just a brief summary. If you want to, and also if you want to chair, whatever you would like. Yoram is an Israeli researcher, diplomat, writer, lecturer, and consultant to Israeli and U.S. legislators and their staffers. He is an expert on U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East affairs, and Jewish-Arab demography. Ettinger is a co-founder of the America-Israel Demographic Research Group, AIDRG, which has documented a 2 million gap in the number of Arabs in the Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. So again, you'll see that we have a microphone here as well. This is the pedagogy of how we'll deploy this presentation. Is he will share with, for those that are watching online, Yoram Ettinger will share with us his hartza'ah, his speech. But then this is also an open forum. So please, we'd like for you to be able to ask questions, what's going on. We know that our world has forever changed post-October 7th. So if you have questions, comments, please think of them. You can write them down, and we'll definitely have time for everyone to ask those questions. But let's get, when we think of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the state of Israel, this is our homeland. And anytime we can hear about Israel, it really elevates the Kedusha, elevates the holiness and the sanctity of this space and of what we're doing, our mission here as American Jews, Jewish Americans, and the future of Am Yisrael. We are part of that future as well. So I want to wish all of us hatzlacha. We should only have success in all of our endeavors. And bruchim habayim to Yoram Ettinger.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I would like to start with an old episode from the Romans' time, the Roman Empire, when they used to throw men, gladiators, to the arena to fight lions. And one of those poor human being was thrown into the arena, and he knew from the beginning that he stood no chance fighting the lion. So he decided, rather than fight, pray. And he knelt down, he covered his eyes with his hands and started praying. And he heard the dungeon gate open, and he heard the lion roaming toward him, and he heard the crowd yelling, blood, blood, blood. And suddenly, quiet, divine silence. And he was thinking, well, I must be dead. But then, if I can think, I'm still alive. So he gathered some courage, opened one eye, and he saw the lion lying 2 feet away from him, covering its eyes with its paws. And the person said, wow, it worked. And he said, psst, psst, lion, are you also praying? And the lion said, hell yes, I'm saying grace. And many times when I hear pronouncements by Western policymakers, Western media, Western academia about the Middle East, I am reminded of this story because the gap between the perception or actually the misperception and the reality is almost 180. And it has to do for instance, with the current state of affairs between U.S. and Israel, where, as we know, there is pressure on Israel by the State Department to shift from the military option to the diplomatic negotiation option. There is pressure on Israel not to preempt against Hezbollah, and certainly there is pressure on Israel to refrain from any independent military action against Iran. And the atmosphere is not extremely friendly between the State Department again and Israel. Different pronouncements by top Americans contribute to this sense of concern about the future of the relations. But at the same time, when one observes, for instance, the strategic cooperation between the two countries, one could realize very, very quickly that there is a huge difference between the State Department's attitude towards Israel on the one hand and the national security establishment of this country and Israel on the other hand. For instance, on February the 15th, the director of the FBI paid a visit to Israel. He didn't come to Israel to help Israel conduct its war more effectively against Hamas terrorism. He came to Israel to study how is Israel facing this very, very unique challenge of facing not a terror organization, but a terror state. And not just a terror state, but the most fortified terror state ever in human history. And not just the most fortified terror state, but the most fortified terror state conducting most of its terror activities from hospitals and schools and mosques and kindergarten, underground and above ground. There's no precedent to such a war. And the director of the FBI came to Israel, and I think rightly so, to study how do we manage, how do we tackle such a challenge. But the interesting thing, the intriguing element, based on his own pronouncement, is that Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, assumes that October 7, 2023, has already inspired anti-American Islamic organizations, especially Iran-supported anti-American Islamic organizations, Islamic terror organizations, to conduct similar acts of terrorism against the U.S., and not only in the Persian Gulf, not only in Syria and Jordan and Africa and Central Asia, but also on the soil of the United States. And he, in fact, made it clear during 4 different hearings on Capitol Hill, 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate, to the Committee on Homeland Security in both chambers, and the Appropriations Subcommittee on Homeland Security, again, in both chambers. And on each occasion, he repeated his own assessment that October 7 is already generating anti-American terrorist activities in the U.S. homeland to repeat such actions. And when one talks about repeating such actions, again, we go back to the October 7, and there is, in a way, perception and misperception there as well, because supposedly we are talking about 1,400 Israelis murdered, mutilated, beheaded, raped, and then murdered, burned alive, etc., as took place adjacent to Gaza. But when it comes to the American scene, in proportion to the American population, we're talking about 47,000 fatalities. We're talking about 47,000 fatalities murdered by terrorists coming from a neighboring country of the United States, which means more or less 16 September 11. I mean, this is exactly what took place in Israel on October 7 from the point of view of the American dimensions. And I don't think one has to think or compute or assess too long how would the U.S. react if such an horrendous murder or assault by terrorists would take place on the soil of the U.S., which would amount to 16 September 11th. I don't think there would be anything left out of a neighboring country which allows such thing, not only allows, but initiates such an attack. And I think from an American point of view, this is how Americans should assess the damage done to Israel and the Israeli reaction, which compared to what would the American reaction be, is basically pretty much a vegetarian reaction. There is a misperception that we're talking about basically a terror organization that took a whole population hostage, and that population is mostly or largely composed of innocent civilians. But that's a misperception if we observe reality. And the reality, for instance, has to do with the fact that the parents of that population have been sending their children to hate education schools since 1993, when, as a result of this reckless accord in Oslo, Israel allowed the establishment of hate education system west of the Jordan River, including Judea, Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, and Gaza. And by the way, the founder of that hate education was at that time the deputy of Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, who is today subject of a pretty moderate image, ostensibly, supposedly. But more than that, we're talking about population that every Friday goes to mosques, and the mosques feature every Friday hate sermons. And I'm not aware that the population has ever opposed either the hate education in schools, the kindergartens, K through 12, or the hate sermons on Friday in the mosques. And more than that, we're talking about population that since 1993 has praised, celebrated every single act of terrorism against Israel, either committed by Gazans or committed by other terrorists. And finally, we're talking about a population in Gaza where one of the best sellers is the Arab translation of Mein Kampf, Hitler's book. Has been a bestseller for many, many, many years. I'm not sure that such features warrant the adjective of innocent population, innocent civilians, not quiet. The visit by the director of the FBI was not or hasn't been the only one from the national security, domestic and international security intelligence agencies of the US. We're talking about an all-time high number of top American military officers, military experts visiting Israel. And again, to study the way we fight that war, which they expect to face outside the US and eventually could be, maybe even in the homeland here in the US. We're talking about experts in the area of urban warfare. We're talking about Israel fighting an urban warfare, who are coming to Israel to study how do our urban warfare units, special operations and others facing that challenge. And that's not something new in the bilateral relations. I don't know if people are aware that after every single war, and many times during the previous wars, American experts always visited Israel. And they came in order to benefit from the Israeli experience, because to put it in terms of finance or commercial terms, Israel has been the #1 military research and development center, not only for the US military, benefiting from the Israeli battle tactics and adapting those tactics, but we're talking about the defense industry of the US. We have been the #1, the most cost-effective, battle-tested laboratory for the US. We are obviously very, very grateful for the US to provide Israel with combat aircraft, F-15 and F-16 and F-35, very grateful. But this has never been a one-way street, as sadly portrayed by the so-called elite media, and as usually portrayed by even Friends of Israel, who urge the continuation of such cooperation with Israel, but usually fail to mention that the US gets back more, and I emphasize more, than what it provides Israel. Because when you think about those 3 combat aircraft, which are 3 of a few hundred military systems which we gratefully received from the US, the minute the Israeli Air Force gets it, it starts producing lessons. And those lessons are shared literally every single day with the manufacturers and with the Air Force. As I myself learned visiting the Martin Lockheed plant in Fort Worth, Texas, which manufactures the F-35 and the F-16. There is an Israeli team on location, as it is in St. Louis at the Boeing plant, which manufactures the F-15. And as one of the managers who took me around stated, this is our ace team, because they provide us every single day lessons, operationally, maintenance-wise, repair-wise, and those lessons save us the plan anywhere between 10 and 20 years of research and development, which means mega billion-dollar bonanza. But then, said the manager, it's not only that we derived mega billion-dollar bonanza from the fact that this battle-tested laboratory, otherwise called the Israeli Air Force, is using our products, but those lessons are integrated into the next generation of the plane and enhance our competitiveness in the global market. And that generates higher and higher exports, which amount to additional billions of dollars to the plant. And as I said, there are a few hundred military systems. There is the F-15 at Boeing, which I assume, I never visited the plant in St. Louis, I assume similar mega billion-dollar dividend or bonanza to Boeing due to the fact that Israel is using F-15. And by the way, we always get the American combat aircraft a few years before American combat pilot use it operationally, if at all. Most American pilots do not get to fly the combat aircraft operationally because of the very, very few challenges to America which require combat flights, operational flights. But once they do that, whether in the past in Afghanistan or currently over Iraq or Syria or Jordan, once they do that, they do it with the added value of the Israeli Air Force experience, which is shared again every single day with the American pilots. In May, I paid a visit to Capitol Hill, as I do 3-4 times a year, and one of the people I met over there was a congressman from Nebraska, happens to be on Armed Services Committee, and I read about him before I entered the office, and I found out that he is a retired Air Force Brigadier General who commanded an Air Force platoon in the Persian Gulf for 2 or 3 years. So upon entering the office, I said, Congressman, I assume that here in this office, there's no need for me to talk about the benefits derived by the American Air Force from the Israeli Air Force. The reaction was a big smile ear to ear, and the congressman said, what are you talking about benefit? The word benefit minimizes the stream of information and experience which we get from the Israeli Air Force. And for about 15 minutes, he couldn't stop praising the service rendered to the American Air Force by the Israeli Air Force. And after about 15 minutes, I said, well, I assume that you also would include the benefits of the June 1982 Israeli operation against the very advanced, that time, 1982, surface-to-air, ground-to-air Soviet missiles, which were stationed on the border of Syria and Lebanon during the 1982 Israeli war against PLO positions in Lebanon. And those missiles, batteries, were considered to be impossible to penetrate, but the Israelis devised a way to do that, and we destroyed all 20 batteries, and in the process we also downed 80 MiG combat planes. And once again, big smile, and the congressman said, Mr. Ettinger, you're talking to Air Force people here. Myself and my national security advisor, Pat, who served with me as a colonel in the Air Force, but Pat knows much more about the June 1982 benefit than I do. So Pat, why won't you share with our guests your own assessment of the value of that particular Israeli operation. And once again, there was a flow of praises, and the bottom line was that until today, 2024, the lessons of the Israeli operation in June of 1992 serves as a basic lesson for every single new pilot entering the ranks of the American Air Force. And in fact, he said that that operation has changed dramatically the battle tactics of the United States. There are many, many similar examples highlighting the reality of the mutually beneficial two-way street rather than one-way street, and that has to do with some 25 military experts who came to Israel after war of 1967 to study how did we pull off such a war and what's the nature of then the Soviet military systems that we captured. And they spent 3 months in Israel studying the war and went back to the US with heavy volumes of lessons, which again benefited the defense industry and the armed services of the US. As a result of the benefits, after the 73 war, 50 American experts came to Israel, and they stayed for half a year studying those lessons. And this has been the practice during every single confrontation that we have had, in fact, throughout our 76 years of experience, including the current one. And by the way, this is not limited only to the defense industry and the Air Force. It also has to do with the commercial industry. Some 250 high-tech giants in the US maintain research and development centers in Israel in order to leverage what they call the brain power of Israel, and not only the brain power, but the unique challenges faced by Israel. Because when you face challenges in a constructive manner, you don't bow out of the confrontation with the challenges, you defy and you overcome the challenges, which creates numerous applications, numerous innovations, which has benefited greatly those 250 high-tech giants from the US. And we have the Israeli defense R&D at the service of the US industry, and we have the Israeli commercial R&D at the service of the commercial industry in the United States. This is not the only gap between the perception and misperception, the one-way street compared to the reality of a mutually beneficial two-way street. We're talking, for instance, about the reality, or I shouldn't say the reality, the misperception by Western policymakers, which allows them to assume that one can apply to Middle East reality Western norms of, let's say, negotiations. And without elaborating too much, because time is running faster than I expected, but the whole notion of negotiation in the West is dramatically different than in the Middle East. First of all, we're talking about a volcanic area where there hasn't been, since the 7th century, there hasn't been yet intra-Muslim or intra-Arab peaceful coexistence. This is the reality today. After 1,400 years, still no intra-Muslim, no intra-Arab peaceful coexistence, but Western policymakers insist that a dramatic, which some may call suicidal, concession by Israel or gesture by Israel, that would do the trick and the so-called believers will accord the so-called Jewish infidels that which they don't accord to one another. Yet, we're talking about the term of negotiation, which is used very simplistically by Western policymakers. For instance, Israel has succeeded to establish peaceful coexistence after negotiation with 6 Arab countries. We have managed to establish very positive cooperation with Saudi Arabia without peace accord, but still we have it. So next step should be the same thing with the Palestinians. How come Israel does not do that? Well, because there is a reality to contend with. And by definition, you can establish peace accord with an adversary which follows a vision that does not mandate your annihilation. We have peace accord with Egypt and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and South Sudan. All of them would have preferred to have a Middle East devoid of an infidel Jewish entity. But none of them follows a national vision, national strategy which mandates, which requires the annihilation of Israel as a prerequisite for attaining that vision or advancing that vision. On the other hand, we have Hamas and PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, which, or Hezbollah, or Iran, which follow or are driven by visions which mandates the annihilation of the Jewish state as a prerequisite for attaining that strategic goal. Now, this is not based on assumptions, speculations, or certain radical pronouncements by certain Iranians or Hezbollah people or PLO or Hamas people. The PLO was established in 1964, 3 years before Jerusalem was reunited, 3 years before Israel returned to Judea and Samaria. But in 1964, June of 64, the PLO came out with its charter, which stipulated to free Palestine and end occupation of Palestine. We were not in Judea and Samaria, Gaza, or East Jerusalem. But the number one organization within the PLO, headed obviously by Mahmoud Abbas, is Fatah. And Fatah was established in 1959. 1959, we're talking about 8 years before the 1967 war. And still, the charter of Fatah calls for the liberation of Palestine. And all that is the foundation or underlines the hate education in the Palestinian Authority and in Gaza. And all that underlines the Friday sermons in the mosques. And certainly the monthly allowances paid by Mahmoud Abbas to every single family which managed to raise a terrorist. By the way, not only in the Palestinian Authority area, also Hamas terrorists, their relatives, get from Mahmoud Abbas monthly allowances. Certainly, with such adversaries, enemies, there's no way you can reach peace accord. And we should have learned that due to our brief history with Hamas. Since 2007, when they took over control of Gaza, We have had many cycles of violence. Each one was followed by negotiation, which led to, among some people in Israel and abroad, to the delusion of entering the era of peace. But as we know now, each such negotiation ushered in October 7, because every single agreement negotiation simply served as a tailwind to bolster further the capabilities of Hamas, and likewise in the cycle of violence with Hezbollah, and in a similar way, US policy towards Iran, which has followed since February 1979, when the Ayatollahs managed to topple the Shah of Iran, who was the American policeman of the Gulf. And since 79 until today, the US has followed the diplomatic option towards the Ayatollahs, because ostensibly, supposedly, you don't bring a solution through war. You bring a solution through negotiation, through diplomacy, through literally hundreds of billions of dollars, which were showered upon the Ayatollahs, mostly by the US, but by the entire West. And we know today that the Ayatollahs managed to surge from a second-class power when they took over control in 79 to a prime global power, complement of that process of negotiation, which yielded them hundreds of billions of dollars, which were not directed to enhance standard of living, but were directed to bolster anti-American terrorism, anti-American drug trafficking, anti-American money laundering, anti-American proliferation of military systems, not only in the Gulf, not only in the Middle East, not only in Africa, but in the US own hemisphere, from South Chile all the way to US-Mexico border, Mexico itself, and again, going back to the FBI director, according to his own intelligence, US mainland as well. And I would end by referring to the eagerness by the State Department, other policymakers, to establish peace, to reach state of peace in the Middle East, throughout the world, in defiance of reality, by referring to some colloquialism I learned in Texas, where I spend relatively much time. And in Texas, they say, you can put your boots in the oven, but that don't make them biscuits. Apparently, there are some policymakers who think that if they adjust the heat of the oven, it's going to transform boots into biscuits. It doesn't work in the Middle East. I don't think it works anywhere else. I would like to end here and open it to not only your questions, but your comments, preferably some criticism of anything I said, and to shift to here also to a two-way street. And I think he wants the mic.
No, for the people on the Zoom.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your very interesting comments. I'm Rachamim Freer, co-chair of Floridians for the Safety and Security of Israel Institute. We have bi-weekly pro-Israel rallies at the entrance to Miami-Dade College, Kendall campus. Banners, flags, lots of thumbs up, lots of support out here in Kendall for what we do. Anybody who wants to find out more information about our rallies, I'll give them a business card and tell them some information about what we do. Mr. Ambassador, do you feel that it's time for Bibi to get more support for the judicial reform movement? Do you think it's time for maybe the prisoners in the jails to be either evicted or executed? Do you think it's time for the tough approach to take place with Iran, with the bombing of the centrifuges? Thank you very much. Toda Rabah.
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on Israeli domestic policy. To be honest, I don't even spend much time studying Israeli domestic politics, but when it comes to Iran, the attitude towards Iran, in my mind, should be based, like anything else, on track record. What has been the track record of the Ayatollahs since February 79, when they toppled the Shah of Iran? And the track record is very, very clear. They have become the leading epicenter of anti-American terrorism, drug trafficking, money laundering, and proliferation of military systems. They have engaged from day one in subversion and terrorism against every single pro-American Arab regime, especially the oil-producing countries, and mostly Saudi Arabia, due to their rivalry over domination of the Islamic bloc in the world, over their rivalry of control of the Persian Gulf oil, which amounts to some 48% of global oil reserves. And certainly they have tried to leverage the fact that the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which is the #1 oil region in Saudi Arabia, is mostly Shiites, as are the Ayatollahs, while the regime in Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And they have done their utmost to bring down the Saudi regime, and possibly even mostly for the eagerness to control the two holiest cities in Islam, namely Mecca and Medina. Now, should they succeed to topple the House of Saud control of Saudi Arabia, this is going to be a major bonanza to every enemy and rival of the U.S. It's going to deal the U.S. and the Western world a major economic setback, minimally for the fact that the Arabian Peninsula controls the major trade route between the Far East and Europe. It's going to affect dramatically and adversely the price at the pump every town in the United States. And that's only the beginning, because since the early 1980s, the Ayatollahs of Iran have entrenched themselves in Latin America. What in the hell are they doing in Latin America? Well, it shouldn't surprise anyone who knows the vision guiding the Ayatollahs. And their vision has been very clear from day one. And the vision has to do with, #1, toppling every single heretic or apostate regime, namely the non-Shiite Muslims, the Sunnis, are heretics, are apostates, and they must be toppled according to the Ayatollah's Shiite vision, and then bringing the infidel West to submission, and especially what they call the great American Satan, Now, many Americans, and maybe even most people here will say, who are they kidding? They are going to bring down the great American Satan? I would suggest to take it very seriously, very realistically, because all they need to do is go back and ask themselves, how did we fare in February 79 when we took over? Nobody took them seriously. Today, they are a major military power to reckon with, supplying advanced military systems to Russia. And why are they in Latin America? They are in Latin America because they're very smart. And they understand that Latin America is the soft underbelly of the United States. That's the reason they work closely with every single drug cartel in Latin America, most notably Mexico, and then Colombia and Bolivia and Ecuador and Brazil. And not only helping them to market their products, to traffic drugs, but they provide the drug cartels of Mexico with equipment to construct underground tunnels. Those tunnels which they help constructing in Gaza and in Lebanon and Syria in order to attack Israel. They provide the drug cartels with Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, which they provide also to Russia in its war against Ukraine, which they have provided Venezuela, which they see as a stepping ground to attack eventually the United States. And again, going back to Chris Wray, director of the FBI, who stated that there are many sleeper cells controlled by Iran in this country. And many of them have already been identified. And according to him, they plan to murder American personalities. They tried to murder former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former National Security Advisor John Bolton, and there is a longer list which they're working on. And I mention all that because while this is going on, according to the State Department, they qualify for diplomatic option. Not only do they qualify for diplomatic option, but they qualify for suspension and softening of economic sanctions. And that meant, for instance, that until February 2021, when Secretary Blinken entered his new role as Secretary of State, Iran was able to export under the sanctions only 500,000 barrel of oil per day. Since that time, with the suspension and the softening of the sanctions, they managed to surge to 2 to 3 million barrels per day of exports, which means in dollar terms, more than $175 billion added to their national income, which has not been directed towards enhancement of education or welfare or health and medicine and transportation infrastructure, but mostly has been directed, as expected, to intensify their anti-American terror and drug trafficking machine. In my mind, objectively speaking, such a track record does not warrant continuation of diplomatic option which has been self-destructive as far as American interests are concerned. Such a track record warrants reassessment and the definition of Iran's ayatollahs not as a partner to negotiation, but as a target for regime change. Israel-Hamas war orchestrated by the Ayatollahs. Israel-Hezbollah war, orchestrated by the Ayatollahs. The pro-American Hashemite regime in Jordan could be toppled within few minutes, within few days or months, because the Ayatollahs are very, very much involved in Jordan in an attempt to topple that regime. And they do it with the help of the Iran-driven terrorists coming from Syria, coming from Iraq. They do it through cooperation with the Muslim Brotherhood inside Jordan. Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, which haunts every single pro-American regime, but is defined by the State Department as a political, religious, welfare, educational organization, not as a terror organization, which it has been. Namely, the Muslim Brotherhood, they have been the #1 Sunni terror organization in the entire world, threatening the regime of pro-US Egypt, pro-US Saudi Arabia, pro-US Jordan, pro-US United Arab Emirates, pro-US Bahrain, and by the way, all the way to India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. But the State Department regards them as subject to embrace, allowing them to enter the top ranks in the administration, etc.
Where do we go from here? Is there any vision for possible improvement?
Where do we go from here? The prerequisite for improvement is very clear. To stop subordinating Middle East reality to alternate reality and deal with the Middle East as it is. Namely, it has been for 1,400 years a most frustrating region, a region which defies solutions. And the way to deal with it in a most effective way is not to express frustration, abandon reality, and engage in an addiction to the drug of peace now, negotiation now, settlement now, but rather to realize this is a multi-generation uphill, steep uphill battle, which has to be based on reality, not on oversimplification and not on wishful thinking. I don't think that anyone could advance the fortunes of the Middle East or any part of the world through a policy which is driven by wishful thinking. Any policy driven by wishful thinking is most self-destructive. And we in Israel have demonstrated that. 1993, well-meaning Israeli leaders took, at that time, the leading terror organization, PLO, from faraway camps in Sudan and Yemen and Tunisia, and imported it into the heartland of Israel, deluding themselves, our leaders, that they will appreciate that. And rather than deal with terrorism, they're going to deal with welfare and crime and education. And what we have learned since that time, those of us who needed to learn, there were those of us who did not need to learn because we knew it all along, and part of the reason because we could read the writing on the wall. Writing on the wall was written with font size 80 or 100. But still, policymakers in the West definitely, but shamefully also in Israel, refused to read the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall has taught us for generations that terrorists bite the hand that feeds them. The US has learned that, and Israel has learned that. For instance, It was the US which facilitated the rise of the Ayatollahs to control in Iran. It was President Jimmy Carter who stabbed the back of the Shah of Iran, deluding himself, by the way, through the State Department, that the Ayatollah Khomeini was an old man hating communism and therefore amenable to cordial relations with the US. As Jimmy Carter told a group of leaders who convened 10 days before the Ayatollahs took over control, they convened in the, I forgot the name of the islands, where they had their convention. And Jimmy Carter said, you can rest assured that Ayatollah Khomeini is going to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks. And the American embassy in Tehran sent telegrams those days in 78, 79 to Washington, suggesting that Ayatollah Khomeini should be expected to behave as an Iranian edition of Gandhi. That was the degree of delusion underlying American policy towards Iran. Not much has changed. But what did the Ayatollahs do after such a grand US gesture, navigating them all the way to control of Iran? The first thing they did, they took over the embassy, the US embassy in Tehran, and they held 50 Americans hostage for 444 days. And from the American policemen in the Gulf, they've transformed Iran to be the chief epicenter of anti-American terrorism and drug trafficking. The US was the chief element enabling the Mujahideen to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. What did the Mujahideen do? They partook in September 11. They partook in the bombing of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. It was the US in 2011 that engineered the US NATO-led military offensive against Gaddafi of Libya, who at that time was a major warrior against terrorism. But the State Department was unhappy with the human rights record of Libya, as if you have a choice in the Middle East between those regimes that honor human rights and those regimes that violate human rights. Taking down Gaddafi and allowing the Islamic terrorists to lynch him transformed Libya into an anti-American arena of Islamic terrorism, raging until this very day. And Israel learned it. We allowed the PLO in, which triggered unprecedented wave of terrorism, but that did not convince our reckless leaders. So in 2005, they said, well, maybe some more gestures are required. So they uprooted Jewish communities and the IDF bases from Gaza, assuring the Israelis that this is going to moderate the atmosphere, which led the way to October 7, led the way to many thousands of missiles hitting every single part of Israel. And therefore, any gestures in the Middle East, any retreats in the Middle East, and I would say beyond the Middle East, are always interpreted by rogue regimes as weakness. We may not like it, but that's the reality. And it whets their appetite, and the next thing they do, they bite the hand that feeds them. Yes, please.
I think you're painting history and everything that you paint historically. Those of us are not always aware of the facts and figures. And we understand, most of us, I think, that what we're dealing with is a cultural difference in approach. And in the United States, their weakness, as you point out, is their humanity towards humanity, when one side isn't necessarily humanitarian, but only humanitarian towards their own goals. We, as the United States, need an eye awakening. You go to Washington, you say, how do you convince your colleagues? It's we, the people, who don't see and understand what you're saying. When they had the Abraham Accords, not many people knew what they were or could understand why did all those nations agree to participate and others did not. Why don't most Americans know what it is? Why don't most Americans separate the need for a peace through humanitarianism and sometimes a need for peace through action? How do you do that? It doesn't sound nice,
Well,
even though I may agree with it. But you can't, this country, the United States, has a different vision. Maybe they see the history. Mr. Blinken didn't. And the head of the FBI, I don't know where his brain is or how they can announce it diplomatically. But what happened when we had the first bomb explosion in Wall Street? Some people said, you know, that's a sign. They're planning something. What happened with all those terrorists hidden in cells in Brooklyn? All of a sudden they appeared, nobody saw them, nobody paid attention. It's a cultural thing. And you have to get past the societal and cultural attitude in this country for people to understand more why we shouldn't withhold weapons here and give money to Iran. Why shouldn't we withhold weapons from Israel? And why does Israel always have to bend, or the nations have to bend, to get what they need to move forward, to cut it short? And that's what they're doing. They're prolonging the inevitable.
Well,
And I don't know how you change it.
from my experience on Capitol Hill, off Capitol Hill, and I'm talking about 40 to 50 years of experience, most Americans, most legislators are open-minded. They don't necessarily agree with you, but they're open-minded. They avail themselves for exchange of ideas, as some of the more liberal legislators told me. We don't agree with you, but you bring in new music, and we would like to hear new music. They could have easily said, we don't have time to see you. So I'm very hopeful, I'm very optimistic, but we have to realize it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's not regular marathon, it's a multi-generational marathon. Anyone who thinks, who deludes him or herself that one-on-one meeting, 2 meetings, 100 meetings will turn around one's opinions, underestimates the intelligence of the interlocutor. It takes much more than that. But again, open-minded is there, and again, going back to Texas as I did before, there's a saying in Texas, sometimes even a blade of a grass can deflect a cannonball. And certainly each one here in this hall is more significant than a blade of grass. The question is, do you take the time to register your stance, to register your information with your representative in the House and with the 2 senators? Or do you wrongly assume, and I emphasize wrongly assume, that they don't care about you? They do care. Not only do they care, they are afraid. They are afraid. You walk in the corridors of the House especially, but also in the Senate, and you can hear the battle cry reverberating, "We shall remember in November." And every House member is scared of the voters. But most voters don't leverage it because they assume, they don't care about us. Why should we pick up the phone? Why should we send an email? Why should we go to a meeting? Why should we invite ourselves to the office of the congressman? it makes a difference. When it comes to the Abraham Accord, a critical element in my mind is to realize none of the 6 Arab countries that concluded peace accords with Israel, the 4 Abraham Accords, and then Jordan and Egypt, none of them did it because they finally realized that the Jewish state genuinely is seeking peace. Each one of them did it due to one major factor, and it's called Israel's posture of deterrence. The Saudis have forged close ties with Israel, especially in the area of defense, as well as irrigation and agriculture and high-tech, not because of our values, but because they're looking for a partner to stand with them against the Ayatollahs and the Muslim Brotherhood. They do not trust the USA, which at best zigzags between president to president. They do not trust NATO, which long ago lost its will to flex its muscles. If there is any muscle left, some say NATO, which used to be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has become a no-action, talk-only organization. And they certainly don't trust fellow Arabs because each one of their fellow Arabs has the machete of the Ayatollahs and the Muslim Brotherhood at their own throat. And they view Israel as the only credible life insurance agent, or I should say, they did view Israel that way until October 7. October 7 demolished, with 4 exclamation marks, Israel's posture of deterrence. And without posture of deterrence, you cannot survive in the Middle East. And everything which Israel has done since October 8 has been directed at mostly one thing, which is required to guarantee our survival: restoring our posture of deterrence. That's the reason we fight Hamas and Hezbollah, and that's the reason we reacted the way we did to the Houthis in Yemen, and to an extent to the Ayatollahs. And that's the reason, in my mind, we cannot accept anyone demanding us to declare ceasefire with Hamas. You declare ceasefire with Hamas, you basically declare Hamas as a winner. We may not see it that way. Israeli generals may not see it that way. It doesn't matter. The Middle East, and in my mind rightly so, would declare Hamas as a victorious party, a historically victorious party, if they manage to be snatched from oblivion. And at this stage, it's the State Department that is assisting Hamas' attempt to avoid obliteration. And again, this is a self-destructive step by the State Department, because Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, going back to its establishment in 1928, follows a charter or constitution which mandates to bring the infidel West to submission, and primarily the United States. If you help Hamas survive, you risk losing every one of America's Arab allies in the Middle East. If you allow Hamas to survive, you provide tailwind to anti-American Islamic terrorism. And therefore, the pressure on Israel to shift from the military option against Hamas to the negotiation and diplomatic option to avoid obliteration and limit our military devastation of Hamas not only threatens the survival of Israel because we're not going to restore our posture of deterrence, but is going to haunt the U.S., as I mentioned before, to retribution by the Muslim terrorists, which would dwarf September 11. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and I must say I agree 150% with every single thing you've said. And what pleased me, among many, many different things, I'm from Venezuela.
Oh.
And I left Venezuela many years ago. And at that time, there were about 60,000 Jews in the country. Today, there's less than 5,000. And Chavez and Maduro were very pro-Iran, very pro-Syria. There's all kinds of relationships there. I haven't been back there since 2007, but when I was there, I was shocked at the influence that Iran has in Venezuela. And Venezuela, as you know, is sitting on tons and tons of oil. And now we got Lula in Brazil, who's really Michigana, all right? And then you've got Chile has also become pro-Palestine, is going on and on and on. And what always worried me years ago as a young adult was, do you have the Monroe Doctrine, but it doesn't really exist. I mean, it exists on paper, but not in reality. And looking forward, tomorrow night there's going to be a very important debate. You know, these two candidates. And Mr. Trump said the other day, no, I just said what he said. I want to get into politics one way or the other. No, he said that Israel will not survive if the other party wins or loses. We don't know what's going to happen. But unfortunately in this country, the degree of anti-Semitism that I have seen, you know, I've been called names, and I've heard that. I never heard that before. So there's something going on that is very sick. Regardless of the political situation, it's the overall feeling of safety of, you know, I'm a Jew, you know, and I spoke to you earlier about the safety and security here. And I've lived in difficult countries. We have one guard at the gate. I can tell you, if I came here with a toy gun, I could make that guard surrender. Because he comes to the door, I just point a gun at him, and I say, get on your knees, and he'll get on his knees. Once he's done that, he's here. So I'm very cognizant of anti-Semitism and people that are crazy, and I'm just really worried going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listened very carefully. My name is Judd Aronowitz, and I'm just going to say I'm sorry. I've listened carefully to what you said about obliteration and 1,400 years. I found it very surprising. You have two terrible enemies with each other. Each see what it's about. But why did Israel even allow Hamas to have the vaccinations? The polio vaccinations. Why did Hamas agree to the polio vaccinations? The thing that bothers me, or the thing that's hopeful about this, is that obliteration of your enemy very rarely happens, not when it's a substantial enemy. The only way you obliterate is to completely deny them all of their resources. Now, someone's saying, great idea, but someone could also deny all of Israel's resources. Somehow or other, people do find a way, and for lack of a better word, I think you used it, they kick the can down the road and they try to solve the problem for today. That is not an admission of weakness, because for 1,400 years of history, where you chose that number, I understand why, people have kicked that can down the road and found some kind of solution. So what I want to ask you is, other than complete obliteration of 2 million people that probably support everything that Hamas has to say, how else do you find a solution?
Okay. The notion that terrorism will always be with us, and therefore, let's not delude ourselves of obliteration or complete victory, again, defies reality. There are police chiefs all over the US, And I'm not aware of any responsible person who said, who needs the police? After all, there's no way that the police can completely obliterate crime. And therefore, it's useless to fight crime. You fight crime, you want to minimize crime. And the same thing with terrorism. Yes, the culture in the Middle East since the 7th century, why 7th century? Because that's the appearance of Islam with its ripple effects throughout the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. There has been terrorism. The first 3 or 4 caliphs who followed Muhammad were murdered. Not a single Arab regime in the Middle East rose to power through ballot. They all rise to power through bullet, namely one or another form of violence. And therefore, they're all very tenuous regimes. They are in control until somebody gets more effective violence to unseat them. And when you talk about tenuous regimes, you talk about tenuous policies. And therefore, you talk about tenuous accords, including peace accords. And I mention that because there have been suggestions, especially State Department, but also other, and including what I call clones, Israeli clones of the State Department, who said, well, if we strike peace accord with Saudi Arabia, we can give up control of the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, which are the Golan Heights of Jerusalem, the Golan Heights of Ben Gurion Airport, the Golan Heights of Tel Aviv, the Golan Heights of 80% of the population of Israel and 80% of the infrastructure of Israel. But we have peace with Saudi Arabia. Isn't that more important than some piece of real estate? No, it's not. Because the mountain ridges of the Judea Samaria are a fixed component of our national security. Any peace accord in the Middle East is a variable. It's a tenuous component of our national security. And certainly, we should not forge our national security based on tenuous grounds. And the problem, in my mind, has to do with well-meaning policymakers in the State Department and in Israel who are so eager, and again, driven by noble values, so eager to bring about an end to the cycle of violence that in the process of that eagerness, they become addicted to an alternate reality which allows them to achieve their goal now, in the short run, in the immediate run. But the outcome of relying on alternate reality is a horrific damage, as we saw in October 7th, when for years people, I'm ashamed to say, in Israel preached, if we allow them to work in Israel, if we allow them to have a port, if we allow them to receive hundreds of millions of dollars, that will allow them to accord more time to non-terror. And they never realized that there's no such thing as Western values in our Middle Eastern society. Not yet. And again, as they say in Texas, when chicken grow lips, then kiss them. But until they grow lips, don't dare kiss any chicken. And last time I checked, Middle East chicken have not grown lips yet.
Okay, quick question. We all can agree that Islamic terrorism is bad. It's a problem. It's been going on for a while. Probably we're not doing enough about it. But being a member of the American Jewish diaspora here in the United States, should it be a concern in the United States about white Christian nationalism? The Project 2025 can be frightening. It's also a problem when you have former presidents and leaders having anti-Semitic people and Holocaust deniers over for dinner. hearing a constant anti-Semitic tropes, the George Soros tropes, and stuff like that. Do you think maybe that there's a chance that that could be just as big a threat here in the United States, the white Christian nationalism? But should that be a concern?
Well, again, I don't claim to be a so-called expert or have any added value on what you call, and I don't know exactly what is Christian nationalism. I'm aware, by the way, that some of Israel's best friends are evangelical Christians. I myself have forged ties with evangelical Christian communities since the early 1980s, when it wasn't yet cool to do that. And I was aware then, as I'm aware now, that there are many, many Jews who were suspicious of the motivations, and I am not aware that any of those suspicions have had any solid ground behind it. But certainly, anti-Semitism, whether it's left or right, should be concerned, because it doesn't only threaten the Jewish community, it threatens the fabric of the whole American society. And therefore, I think that anti-Semitism should be concern for Democrats and for Republicans and for independents, irrespective of the Jewish state and irrespective of Jews.
Ambassador, thank you for coming. I'm actually from Texas, but that state has become so extreme in its government, I go back and visit as seldom as possible.
Where in Texas?
Dallas. Anyway, I agree with you that our State Department has been forever clueless. They don't understand this is a religious war, that as long as radical Islam exists, it wants every land that was ever Islamic to be part of the caliphate, including Spain, etc. I also agree that they don't understand that might makes right in the Middle East. However, given all that, and I agree with your viewpoint, there's another viewpoint that a lot of people in Israel with whom I communicate follow. There's a basic principle in Judaism that the person who saves one life is as if they save a whole world. And this viewpoint is that Israel should make any deal whatsoever, no matter how bad, with Hamas, on the chance that even one living hostage will be released. Hamas will guaranteed violate the deal in some way, after which Israel should go in and wipe them out and would have no one saying that they shouldn't do it. How would you feel about that approach?
Okay. I'm aware of the view that, what's the big deal? Let's sign a deal with Hamas now, and then after we get all the hostages, we are going to obliterate Hamas. I think we should give Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, much more credit than that. Anyone who assumes that Sinwar would accept a deal which does not tie Israel's hands in a most horrific manner by American guarantees of Hamas security. And why only American? British and German and Italian and UN, French, etc., sending a clear message. Should Israel attempt to harm Sinwar after whatever deal is achieved, releasing all hostages, Israel must not take any action, and Israel would. Here is the list of punishment, from supply of weaponry to economic boycott, political, diplomatic boycott, etc. Anyone who assumes that this is not very firm in the cards simply takes Sinwar to be a State Department person, gullible. He is not gullible. We have found out that he is, sadly, much, much smarter than every single Israeli leader. Smarter in a satanic way. But he has conducted an architecture of terrorism which should be studied in every terror academy anywhere in the world. But as far as the opening statement that we must do everything, and I underline the word everything, in order to release even one, let alone 100 hostages, I don't think that this is a serious assumption. What do you mean everything? Committing suicide in order to release people, is this acceptable? If not, so we're not talking about everything. Demolishing Israel's posture of deterrence, which would cause an eruption of terror volcano from Judea and Samaria, which is much, much more dangerous than Gaza, because Judea, Samaria is the Gaza of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Netanya and Herzliya, etc., etc. Is that everything? I don't think so. Have we learned anything from the reckless transaction where we released, I don't remember how many, I think 1,400 terrorists in return for an Israeli named Gilad Shalit? Was this the right thing to do? Well, if one claims it's the right thing to do, then that person should know. October 7th was orchestrated by one of those 1,400 terrorists. And before that, hundreds of Israelis were murdered as a result of that reckless transaction. Now we don't talk about an issue, should it be 1,400 for one Israeli hostage, or should it be only 800, or should it be 6,000? We're talking about much more complicated transaction, because the prerequisite for Hamas, for any deal, is an end to Israel's war on Hamas, which would allow Hamas to regain its position with dramatically more damaging consequences for Israel than October 7. Is that part of the everything? I don't think so. Are we obligated to allow the 100,000 or so evacuees from the south and the north to come back to their homes? And will they come back if Hamas is allowed to remain in Gaza? I don't think most of them will come back to their homes in Gaza. I don't think more than very few are going to come back to their homes in the north if we allow Hezbollah to remain there. And then one could ask a question. Israel doing everything in order to get hostages back, is that going to cause the Saudis to think more highly or very, very lowly of Israel? Because as I mentioned before, the number one guiding element for Saudis to attempt and forge closer ties with Israel has been Israel's posture of deterrence, because they need it in face of Iran. But if we yield to a terror state in Gaza, what does that say about our value in the face of Iran, the Ayatollahs, who are activating, toying with Hamas? Certainly, Israel caving to Hamas demands, to State Department pressure, is going to further demolish our posture of deterrence and minimize the Saudi interest in getting closer to us. Recently, we have had surge of terrorism from Judea and Samaria. I cannot say that with 100% certainty, but my assumption is that recent months of Israel's hesitancy as far as obliterate Hamas or caving into State Department pressure has emboldened more terrorism from Judea Samaria, in my mind, as expected. If we do not obliterate Hamas, we better expect volcano erupting from Judea and Samaria. Is that part of everything? I don't think so. Now, this is a horrific dilemma for any leader. It's easy for me to say what I say, that the safety of 8 million Jews is at least as important as the safety of 100 Israeli hostages. And the fate of thousands of Israeli fatalities resulting from a surge of terrorism as an outcome of reckless deal with Hamas is at least as important as the fate of 100 hostages. I can say that here or in Israel as I do, but I know very well, if one of my relatives would be there, I would act differently. But I expect a leader not to act emotionally and not to act as a father or a son or a grandfather or a brother. I expect a leader to have as the top priority safety of 8 million Jews. And the fact is, we fight continuous wars. And we know that those wars are going to entail losing hundreds and thousands of people. So should we stop fighting wars? And I think that such a way of thinking could potentially lead the way to give up and say, well, we just realized that we'll have to bear arms forever. Is that worth it, to bear arms forever? Let's move to Wyoming. Wyoming, you have buffaloes around, very few people. I know people realize Wyoming has 1 member of the House and 2 senators. They have less than what would require for a congressional district. That's a great place to be, far away from terrorism. Let's move outside of Israel, because it ain't worth it. And I think that the future of any people requires blood, sweat, and tears. And those are not just cheap statements. They are very significant. If we are not willing to sacrifice lives, then we are not worthy of having an independent nation. And this has been the history of the Jewish people and the history of the Jewish state. One more comment, not to leave you with supposedly pessimistic or gloomy view of bearing arms forever, because I am an optimist. And the reason I'm an optimist at this time, during this particular war, is because myself, until the war erupted, I basically gave up on the current younger generation. And some of you may go through the same feeling, younger generation that is glued to the cell phone, is crossing the street, not even looking left and right, but gluing to the cell phone. Young generation that spends more time looking at glued to the cell phone than reading books, studying history, studying, in our case, the Bible, Jewish history, Jewish literature. I gave up on this generation. But from October 7, watching the way the younger generation, I'm talking also the reservists. The reservists are younger generation. Those are people in their late 20s, 30s, and early 40s. To see the way they have reacted, to witness 300,000 Israeli reservists departing from their jobs overseas, universities overseas, or just tourist attractions, and flooding the El Al gates to the extent that the government ordered the Israeli Air Force to avail its transport planes, the C-5, I believe, the American C-5, to transport Israelis from Europe to Israel, because there were 5 or so airports which were declared specially for Israeli reservists who came from Asia and Africa and US, etc. They came to Europe, and as I was told by a friend of mine from the Air Force, those transport planes brought those reservists to Israel exactly the way they used to bring the Ethiopian Jews to Israel, namely sitting on the surface, on the floor of the plane, because there are no sitting facilities there. But to see people doing the 300,000, and many of them still serving in reserve duty, and when you hear the interviews on the radio and television with those people, and I know I have one of my relatives is a reserve duty colonel, commander of artillery battalion, and to speak with them or to listen to them the way they talk about the war, not in terms of only we must not stop, we have to obliterate them, but to listen to them talking about this is a war not only for us, not only for our family, not only for us in Israel, but for the Jewish people, for Jewish history, etc. This is something which I never expected from this generation. And therefore, if we have such a younger generation, we are in for a very, very bright future. And last and not least, this is not, as they say in Texas, it ain't the first time, it ain't the last time, and it ain't the worst time. The Jewish people have gone through worse crises. And guess what? We have proven ourselves to have the capability to surge to new heights after every single crisis. Certainly in Israel, when you observe the waves of terrorism and wars, and look where we were in 1948 and where we are today. And one of the evidence, by the way, is the decision by Intel Corporation going back to November 2023, where they decided to invest $25 billion expanding their facilities in Israel. The CEO of Intel was interviewed on American television, and there he was asked, is this the time to invest, to commit $25 billion to Israel, which is fighting a war? Things are very, very tenuous. Uncertainties are very, very high. And the response by the CEO was, we conducted a study of Israel based on prior crises, and we came to the conclusion, every crisis has produced more and more opportunities, more and more innovations and revolutionary applications, and the time to come to Israel is at this stage, before those new applications and innovations gain in value. And I think he was very realistic in stating that, and I trust that we're going to prove him right. And thank you very much for being here, and please don't forsake your representative and your 2 senators. They could benefit greatly from anything that you have on your mind. Thank you.
Everyone, thank you. Toda rabah to Yoram Ettinger. Again, toda rabah. Please, again, drive safely. Have a good evening. This concludes our event this evening. But please, again, go on our website, beitshira.org. Maybe we have some pamphlets outside. This week, every week, we have all kinds of programs, activities, ways to connect. We've got things going on this week. So we look forward to seeing everyone. Be safe. Have a great night. And Erev Tov, Laila Tov, and Shalom Uvracha. Peace and blessings to all of us.